If there is one country upon which Russia has been able to rely for a steady flow of cash during the Ukraine war, it's China. As Western nations sanctioned Russia and started moving away from the country's oil, China seized the opportunity to buy more. The deal worked out. China got more oil at a discounted rate, and Russia kept receiving money it could use to fund the war. Now everything has changed. China's President Xi Jinping has betrayed Vladimir Putin by delivering a crippling blow to Russia's war machine. And it's a blow that couldn't have happened without the US and its sanctions. On October 23rd, The Telegraph reported that several of China's state-owned oil companies have suspended all purchases of Russian seaborne oil. The words state-owned tell you everything that you need to know about Xi's involvement in the decision. The Communist Party of China, which Xi leads, essentially owns these companies, meaning the decision to suspend purchases would have ultimately been made by Xi. Right now, 4 of China's biggest oil companies have called a halt to their purchases. Sinopec, CNOOC, PetroChina, and Zhenhua Oil all have temporary suspensions in place as they await to see what the future brings. And that brings us to the big question: why? As we mentioned earlier, China has been enjoying the fruits of a great deal with Russia since Putin invaded Ukraine. It's been buying oil by the millions of barrels and spending far less on that oil than it would if it purchased it from other suppliers. For Xi to say no more seaborne oil, something major must have happened, and it did. The US sanctioned 2 of Russia's largest oil companies. China's decision to suspend its Russian oil purchases comes in the wake of the US implementing sanctions that target Rosneft and Lukoil. The 2 companies are Russia's second and third largest energy giants, with both coming behind natural gas behemoth Gazprom when it comes to the sheer amount of revenue they generate, both for their owners and for Russia's wartime coffers. Al Jazeera reports that the 2 companies collectively export about 3.1 million barrels of crude oil per day, creating an approximate annual total of 1.1315 billion barrels. That's enough to account for 70% of all Russia's crude oil exports, making the US decision to target these companies a very intelligent move. Rosneft and Lukoil are 2 of Russia's heavy hitters. Losing their sales will be devastating to Putin and his war machine. The US decision comes on the back of the UK implementing similar sanctions against the same 2 companies, suggesting that the collective West is purposefully targeting Russia's seaborne oil sales. When the sanctions were announced, Russia must have known that some of its buyers would become casualties, but China, Russia's largest importer of seaborne oil, surely that one country has the economic might to stand up to the US sanctions and continue buying from Russia. Apparently not. And we'll explain why later in the video. Now that we know that the US is behind Xi's betrayal of Putin, the next why question is, why did the US choose now to go after 2 of Russia's largest oil giants? The answer is that it's all Putin's fault. Just a few days ago, US President Donald Trump was preparing to meet Putin in Hungary for a summit that would allow the 2 leaders to discuss how to move the Ukraine war peace process forward. That summit was unexpectedly cancelled, with Trump declaring that he has no interest in taking part in a wasted meeting with Putin. On October 22nd, Trump elaborated on these comments, stating, "Every time I speak to Vladimir, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere." What we see here are signs of frustration with Putin building in the US administration. Those frustrations have now boiled over, with the sanctions that have caused Xi's betrayal of Putin being the direct result. "I just felt it was time. We waited a long time," Trump said when asked why he implemented the new sanctions. The US president adds that he hopes the pain these sanctions cause will bring Putin to the negotiating table once more, and more importantly, that Russia's leader will actually arrive with a productive mindset. So this was a punishment for Putin, and it's one that has shocked the Kremlin to its core. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which expanded on just how deep the US sanctions go. America hasn't just targeted the main companies of Rosneft and Lukoil. 6 of Lukoil's subsidiaries, along with 28 companies that fall under the Rosneft banner, have fallen victim to the US sanctions. Just one of the Lukoil subsidiaries alone, Lukoil Western Siberia, accounts for around 40% of Lukoil's hydrocarbon production, the outlet adds. Trump's new sanctions aren't just for show. The US has done its research to implement a sanctions package that covers every possible base. The one saving grace for Russia is that the sanctions aren't going to come into force all at once. That's according to Chatham House Associate Fellow Timothy Ash, who tells The Telegraph, "These sanctions will be rolled out over 4 weeks, so Russia will still have time to figure out countermeasures. But it will increase the discount Russia has to offer customers to buy its oil, and that means lower budget revenues at a time when its buffers have already been worn down after 3.5 years of war. Perhaps China will eventually benefit from that discount again in the future." But for now, Xi has betrayed Putin, willingly or otherwise, as the US has finally flexed a muscle big enough to make China stand up and take notice. China isn't especially happy about having to suspend its seaborne Russian oil purchases. In its report on the US sanctions, Newsweek notes that China opposes what the US is doing and has suggested that the sanctions have no basis in international law. China also bemoaned the fact that the sanctions haven't received authorization from the United Nations Security Council. Guo Jiakun, who is a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, made these points and added, "Dialogue and negotiation are the only feasible ways to resolve the Ukraine crisis, rather than coercion and pressure." Guo may have a point, though the legality aspect is a complicated legal issue. The UK's House of Commons Library explained why in a November 2024 article, explaining how sanctions operate in conjunction with international law. The use of sanctions by states, particularly outside the framework of the United Nations Security Council, has a complicated relationship with international law. Depending on the measures adopted by a state, sanctions could be an entirely legal exercise of its sovereignty or a potentially unlawful breach of international law that would require some justification, the library says. So it's possible that the US may face some blowback for its move from the United Nations Security Council. How much power the Council would have to stop the US is up for debate, assuming the Council would even want to get involved with these new sanctions. In the end, China's complaints don't amount to much, as the US has managed to push some of Beijing's biggest energy companies into halting their Russian oil purchases. That's bad enough for Putin and his Ukraine war effort. However, it's not just China that's betraying Russia under US pressure. India seems to be on its way out the door too, and if India follows China's lead, that's two of Russia's biggest oil customers, saying they will no longer be spending billions of dollars on Russia's most valuable product. On October 22nd, CNBC reported that India is already planning to cut its oil purchases from Russia in the wake of the new US sanctions. Trump himself says that he has received assurances from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi of that decision to move away from Russian oil. Talking to reporters aboard Air Force One, the US president said, "He's not going to buy much oil from Russia. He wants to see that war end as much as I do. He wants to see the war end with Russia, Ukraine, and as you know, they're not going to be buying too much oil." Of course, there's a pretty big carrot hanging on the end of a stick that's encouraging India to make this decision. CNBC notes that the US is likely going to slash the 50% tariff it currently has in place on Indian exports to the 15% range in return for India's decision. Again, this is the US flexing its financial muscle, proving to Putin that it has the power to make even those who benefit most from Russia's cheap oil turn away from him. Modi and Xi benefit more than most. They are now betraying Putin. And Ukraine is very happy with the pressure that Trump is exerting. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky used his platform on X to laud the US sanctions on October 23rd. The new US sanctions against Russia's oil giants are a clear signal that prolonging the war and spreading terror come at a cost. And this is a fair and absolutely deserved step. It's precisely pressure on Russia that will be effective for achieving peace, and sanctions are one of its key components, Zelensky claimed. His comments were mirrored by Ukraine's sanctions envoy Vladislav Vlasyuk, who took to Facebook to add, "All of this is now under sanctions. The remarkable aspect of this decision is its complexity and comprehensiveness. The full infrastructure is targeted, exactly the way it should be. I think this will have a quick and great effect. No one will want to buy oil from these exporters, as there will be a risk of secondary US sanctions." Russia's response has been less effusive. Privately, Putin must be absolutely kicking himself, as if it was his stubborn refusal to budge from his maximalist demands for a Ukraine war peace deal that led Trump to deciding any meeting right now would be useless. Russia's president has spent the entire year trying to play Trump, and at times it seemed like he was succeeding. Now he faces renewed economic pressure as the war that he started crawls closer to the end of its fourth year. The Guardian reports that Putin tried to put a brave face on it all. He called the sanctions an unfriendly act that does nothing to strengthen Russian-American relations, in what seems like a desperate attempt to convince Trump that he will hurt his own country by placing so much pressure on Russia. Putin encouraged Trump to think about who his administration is really working for, in an odd measure that was accompanied by Putin making a vague claim that the sanctions would lead to a rise in prices. But as for what Russia is going to do next, Putin has a much clearer message. No self-respecting country ever does anything under pressure. Those words imply that Putin has no intention of backing down from his Ukraine war, and may now even be less likely to come to the negotiating table than he was before. Is Putin serious? Or is this all bluster as Putin scrambles to find a way to convince the US to back down from measures that he knows deep down are going to cause some serious damage? We will have to wait and see. Other Russian commentators have been less diplomatic in their approaches. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev has thrown around the usual threats that arise whenever anything happens that doesn't go in Russia's favor. The US is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully embarked on the warpath with Russia. The decisions taken are an act of war against Russia, and now Trump has fully aligned himself with loony Europe. Medvedev raged in response to the US sanctions. Of course, Medvedev exists to say things that Putin himself won't say, so his words are essentially Putin's true feelings on the matter. Putin is panicking because he knows that losing China's oil purchases is going to hurt. That brings us nicely to the impact that China's betrayal of Russia caused by the new US sanctions has the potential to have. The most direct and obvious impact is monetary. China was buying a lot of Russian oil, to the point where it was contributing tens of billions of dollars to Putin's wartime economy. In 2024 alone, China purchased $62.59 billion of Russian crude oil, according to Trading Economics. That year also broke the record for the most money that China had ever spent on Russia's most important product. That record had been broken 2 times before, in 2023 and 2022. China spent $60.7 billion on Russian crude oil in 2023 and $58.4 billion in 2022. And if there's any doubt that China was taking advantage of Russia's oil being cheaper due to the war, its 2021 crude purchases amounted to a little over $40 billion. China has been spending about $20 billion more on Russian crude per year since Putin invaded Ukraine than it spent the year before the invasion started. Now, China isn't cancelling all of its Russian oil purchases. Its decision only accounts for seaborne oil imports, which Reuters says amounts to 1.4 million barrels per day. Another Reuters article notes that China's total imports of Russian oil amount to 2.1 million daily barrels. Right now, land-based imports don't seem to be affected by China's decision. The maths works out pretty conveniently here to reveal that 2/3 of China's Russian crude imports arrive by the sea. That's what China is cutting off. And it also allows us to get a bead on how much of a financial impact Xi's decision will have on Putin's war effort. As we see from the figures shared earlier, China is spending roughly $60 billion on Russian oil annually. If 2/3 of those purchases are going to stop, that's $40 billion in oil revenue that Putin can no longer tax to support his country's military or his country in general. This is no small chunk of change. It's a potentially game-changing amount to lose at a time when Russian ministers are warning that Russia is on the brink of a recession. Add India into the mix and you get some serious damage to Russia. The $230 billion or so that Newsweek claims China has spent on Russian oil since February 2022 is accompanied by almost $160 billion of purchases from India. That $230 billion figure clashes slightly with the Trading Economics figure. The point still stands that it's a lot of money. With India also cutting off the supply of Russian oil, perhaps even more permanently than China, if it gets the tariff deal it's looking for, you have a recipe for disaster that will push Russia over the precipice into complete economic collapse. And it's not just the money side of the trade impact that's going to deliver a swift kick to Putin's gut. It's what all of this means for the relationship between China and Russia going forward. China has always outwardly claimed that it wants to see a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war, but in its actions, China has typically been behind Russia. The massive oil purchases pumping billions into Russia's economy are proof of that. And as the Telegraph reported in September, China has also happily sold dual-use components to Russia that can be used in the construction of drones. Engineers from China have even worked with a sanctioned Russian weapons manufacturer to help Putin's forces make their drones more effective. On the surface, the relationship between Russia and China looked strong. However, the reality is that China has been taking advantage of Russia's weak position, especially when it comes to buying Putin's oil. It's no coincidence that China's purchases of Russian crude oil rocketed up when Putin launched the Ukraine war. Sanctions ripped through Russia's oil industry, forcing Russia to offer its oil to countries like China at a lower price than it would usually have asked for. China has spent the last 3 years or so taking full advantage, knowing that it could pull the plug at any time to leave Russia in a precarious position. It's China that has all of the power in this supposed alliance. And with a push from the US, it has just exercised that power. Oil may have once brought Russia and China closer together, but it's also the source of a massive power imbalance that Putin wants to pretend doesn't exist. The European Union Institute for Security Studies, or EUISS, highlighted this imbalance in an October 2nd article. It noted that China has thrown its weight behind Russia for so long because China and Russia share some ideological similarities. The dismantling of the Western power structure is one of them, and it's likely the driving force behind the relationship. However, China has been the dominant partner every step of the way, and cutting off its oil purchases now demonstrates to Putin how subservient he has made Russia to China. Despite consistent growth in imports and exports in recent years, the Russia-China economic relationship remains deeply asymmetrical, the EUISS says. Russia is becoming increasingly reliant on China across a widening range of product categories, while Beijing maintains minimal exposure to Russian inputs. China may not have decided to cut off its Russian oil purchases right now if it had the choice, but the odds are that it won't be too angry about being pushed into doing so. This single act highlights Russia's growing dependency on China as a provider of money, and Xi may now be plotting to dig his talons deeper into Russia. Perhaps a demand for even greater discounts is on the horizon in return for China reactivating its purchases. There's a natural argument for China to make here, as those discounts can cover the cost of angering the US and exposing itself to secondary sanctions. China also knows that it's a far more valuable trading partner to the US than Russia will ever be. The Office of the United States Trade Representative highlights this. It says that US trade of goods and services with China totaled $658.9 billion in 2024. Trade with Russia was just $3.5 billion during the same year. This massive disparity gives China a ton of leverage that it can use to renegotiate itself into a better position with the US in the future, even if it does end up buying Russian oil again. China has a win-win on its hands here. It could use the US sanctions and its response to them as a way to reopen dialogue with the US over the tariff war that consumes both the US and China right now. Russia would be left in the dust if China makes that choice. Or China could resume Russian oil purchases at an even lower rate than ever, because it knows that its sheer economic strength will be enough for it to be able to renegotiate with the US in the future. In this scenario, Russia gets some short-term relief, but it still ends up potentially being abandoned by China in the future, and if not abandoned, then made even more subservient than it already is. There are some caveats. As we mentioned earlier, the oil trade between China and Russia isn't going to stop entirely, as land-based transportation is still an option. The cutoff only affects seaborne oil. Plus, as the Telegraph notes, analysts are already suggesting that the Chinese cutoff is temporary and that Russia and China may work together to find a workaround. That would be the best-case scenario for Putin, but even if a workaround is found, Putin has just learned the very harsh lesson that China is willing to abandon Russia to its economic fate if enough pressure is placed upon Beijing. Putin needs Xi a lot more than Xi needs Putin. And there's nothing Russia's president can do to change that fact. After all, Putin is already willingly giving up parts of Russia to Chinese and North Korean control. The Russian Far East is falling into the hands of those two countries, and it's happening because Putin opened the door only to find that he has no way of closing it. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos discussing Russia's increasingly difficult oil situation. And thank you for watching.